Hey everyone, welcome back to the It's a Mind Game podcast. My name is Jade, and today I'm so thrilled to have Jacqueline joining us to discuss more about values. Now, a quick throwback to anyone who might have missed the last episode. I would highly encourage you to listen to that one first, because with that comes some talk on values, a worksheet on how to start assessing your values, and then due to, I guess, the high amount of feedback, Jacqueline, we've come in with a Q&A from some of the lovely women in our communities to open up the conversation even more in a way that I guess fulfills our listeners and the path that they're on right now. So before we deep dive in, welcome back. I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm so glad for the opportunity to continue this conversation, Jay. We had such awesome feedback, and it's actually quite a layered idea, the concept of values. So I'm really happy for the opportunity to do justice to our listeners and unpack that a bit more.
Wonderful. Now, why don't we just dive straight in and begin with some of our submitted questions. Would you like to go first?
Sure. We had some really thoughtful, reflective questions. One was, why can values feel so clear? For example, the value of body neutrality, health, nourishing yourself, and yet your behaviours betray your values.
It's a very deep and well thought out question. So thank you for whoever submitted that. Because I feel like so many would be feeling the same thing. It's like I value health, though I feel like it's so difficult, or almost like pulling my teeth out in order to pursue what health means. I guess for me, listening to that question, a big part of that would be getting clarity on what health means, because I feel like it's such a surface level word and it can mean so many different things to so many different people. So for some, health could be going for a walk, eating predominantly whole foods, loves a bit of takeaway, has time with family and friends, and that's healthy for them. Where somebody else could be eating takeaway most nights of the week, training 5-6 days a week, and that's their version of health. And I guess if you're on the eating disorder or HA recovery or exercise addiction bandwagon, a big part of the conflict lies of your definition of health was a particular thing, whether it be dieting, training, being a particular shape or size, and now you're trying to be healthy again, but there's not much clarity in, I guess, your mind's eye on what that is, because you've always been striving for health. For the most part, this is probably how you got into the position that you're in right now, was striving for health. So then we change the target and go, now I'm trying to be healthy. And it's quite confusing because the words haven't changed. So I guess getting clarity on what health means. So if you're in ED recovery or HA recovery, that could be, well, following some of the pillars, which is making sure you're eating every couple of hours, making sure that you've got a nice balance of exercise that has you feeling good by the end of it and not completely exhausted. Perhaps it is challenging some foods and inviting in new experiences. But in order to progress forward, I think a lot of like clear cut terms on what it means, so that then you actually have a target that means something to you, rather than sort of having an idea. But I would love to know, because you've worked with so many women on this question, Jacqueline, I guess, how do you redirect women into helping them define what health is and get them to where they want to be when they're feeling really, really stuck?
Your example is so helpful, because it really is the importance of deconstructing the assumed value. And sometimes even in the dating world, there was a trend to look at compatible values versus compatible interests, for example. And so you could, maybe a more helpful question for longer term relationship success would be to look at values compatibility with someone you're dating versus, like, do we like the same music, for example. However, I think so much can be misunderstood in that if we aren't more nuanced in that conversation, because as you're describing, both parties could say, I value health, I value health too. Good, tick, let's move on to the next one. But what that translates to in your lifestyles and in your priorities is actually very different. And to somebody, health might be balance, it might be the health of their social life, it might be prioritizing sleep, and somebody else is in a different framework with how they're making sense of that. So certainly understanding that can be incredibly important. There were two things that came up for me in reading this question as well, with wanting to know the value under the value can sometimes be really helpful. So even if we say, look at health and asked, why is it that I want to be healthy? Maybe it comes down to something like legacy, actually. Like, I want to be here for long enough to be with my children and support them into their life, or I want to be able to contribute to a community and make a difference. So if we dove a bit deeper, we appreciate the motivating factor into the presenting value. And that might be interesting if someone felt at odds with their values because they do believe in health and their intellectual self, their conscious self is very on board with that, but they feel these unconscious behaviors are disrupting their pursuit towards that value. It might be useful to see if there's a deeper value that they are actually closer to at the present time and move forward in that space, and then let health evolve more specifically as that comes through from that direction. Sometimes that can happen when we're leapfrogging a little bit, like that value looks really attractive when we're allured by it, but where there's something in us that doesn't quite trust it or isn't quite ready for it. For example, if someone had a restrictive history, they might want to pursue the health value, but their body's almost allergic to that because it perceives it as restrictive or it perceives it as too rules-based. So it feels like, well, no, now I'm just trying to be healthy. I'm trying to do the right thing. It's not what it used to be. But there are different parts of us that are at different stages of maybe it not being cohesive yet. And that's also, when I think about values, I think it's important to think about your relationship with the value. So it's not just the stance of I value health, therefore I live with that as a priority in my life. But how do I actually engage with and respond to the concept of health and looking more into that interactive space can sometimes give clues as to where it's maybe not going the direction we'd expect it to. And the last thought I had on this one was also to acknowledge the role of trauma in responding to values that we might consciously want, because if we're in a survival mode, again, we won't be able to curate that part of our life in the way that we would desire, because we might understand that those acts would be better for our physical health and our health goals. However, in the moment where we're dissociated, or if we're in fight or flight, if we're not going to be able to use the part of our brain that understands that and holds that knowledge, and that can be incredibly frustrating, but it's an important part of understanding why they can get halted.
There's so many important takeaways from what you just said there. I guess one of the things I want to dabble into first was how you said there can be underlying values to the first-hand value. And for anyone listening who's sort of newer to the values idea, what are maybe some common values of health that kind of sit underneath the health banner? Because I'd imagine there's a couple listening going, oh, I know I need more, like that idea of health isn't enough to drive me forward or make these changes that we're talking about, though I know it's an important system. What potential links could there be for anyone just, trying to fetch roots for what this value needs to get some momentum?
Pardon me, that's such a good question, Jade, because it is really, our values come down to being very human and what we seek out as humans, and that idea of there being 7 stories written different ways, that Shakespearean idea of there only being so many tales told in different ways. So the same could be said of our values, that usually they boil down to wanting to matter, wanting to be needed, wanting to contribute. And it could be interesting to look at how they sit alongside our core beliefs about ourselves. So people that struggle with disordered eating, over-exercising, health obsessive behaviours tend to have one of the following beliefs: either I am not enough, there's something deeply wrong with me, or I am broken, I am a fraud, I'll be found out. That feeling of you think I'm good, you think I'm impressive, but if you really knew me, that you wouldn't love me the same way. That could come undone at any time, which is also where it's important to really examine our values and just be open to them evolving over time, which speaks to another question that's come up. Because often, I said in our last conversations that our core values are often established by the age of 7. I want to come back to that and explain that a little bit more. But it's also true that our early manifestation of values are quite socially reactive, and they're, well, I value this because my family values this, and I need to value this to be able to belong to this tribe and to be accepted in this tribe. And so sometimes unpacking that over time, where it just feels like it starts not to fit as well, or we want to live differently, we'll start to feel that. But thinking about, I'd come back to that question of, why do I want this at the deepest level? So not, I just want to be healthy, so I have lots of energy, and that might be level 1, but going a bit deeper with it as to, why does it really matter for me in this lifetime to have this value as a priority? We were saying in the last conversation, if you were to lead through life with, say, 3 top values, what would they be? If health was one of those top 3, it's suggesting that it's exceptionally important in your life. So what is it that it represents that means so much that you would put a third of your life energy towards it? And then sometimes we can see that the value within the value can be more consistent across a lifetime. We understand that translated in different ways, but the value we thought it was on top might outfit change a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess that's where it can be quite complex when trying to be led by values too, which I guess opens up a whole other can of worms, because just when you suggested some of those underlying elements of eating disorder recovery, that idea of needing to matter, to feel needed, to contribute, because they can both really help us lead a really positive, helpful life, but they can also be quite debilitating. And there's been quite a few women that I've actually spoken to through the podcast, and some of their insights throughout their recovery journey was this idea that so many people are worried about me, and while I don't want them to worry, it keeps them close, and I'm scared that if I'm well, they could leave me because I'm not worth enough as my healthy self for them to stay. And instantly you can see how the inner turmoil of that is just horrible. Like it makes my skin go goosebumps as I say it, because I couldn't imagine feeling more stuck than having that idea of being unwell keeps people near me. And if I'm well, like, where's the motivating factor in that? But if someone was to sort of present that idea of, I know I want health, but I'm almost scared to pursue it because the end goal doesn't seem desirable, I guess, is there other values we could perhaps start to brainstorm or think about that might open up our perception to the idea that those around us love us for more than our unwell self? I'm not sure if I worded that correctly, but
I love that example, because it's narrative therapy that I practice, and looking at values often tries to come from a really strengths-based orientation. So you can look at that scenario you spoke through, and I got goosebumps as well, because it's just heartbreaking to think of someone in a situation where that's the best way they know to get their needs met and to be seen and feel loved. But I also see within that someone that wants closeness and someone that wants love, and where love matters to them. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts of this work, is that I have never discovered that someone's ultimate value is wanting others to suffer or wanting to be destructive. It's the behaviors might look like that sometimes, but under that is usually, I want connection, I want closeness, I want validation. And those are incredibly healthy things to want as human beings. We just don't always know how to best use that, or life experiences haven't offered the opportunity yet to create a way of meeting that which would be make us feel more self-sufficient or give us more agency. So it's the best way we've got of meeting that value at that time. But if we could understand that, like if that person in that scenario could even understand that what they're wanting, what they're deeply wanting, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's actually a sign of being a really healthy individual. There might be a big exhale that comes along with that, because it's not saying, no, you need to be totally independent, and when you're well, go stand on your own 2 feet and be an island and you're abandoned. It would be recreating the image of where they could maybe be moving forward in connection and with support in a more health supportive or liberating version of that than what they've known. So that's a good example, I think, in finding the value under the value, or looking to another way of thinking of values is using them as constellations in our journey, that they're the lights we follow when we're struggling on the ground, and the day-to-day, you know, it's impossible to only enact your values. Of course, we're going to all go off track a lot of the time. But if we've got some sense of where we're wanting to come back to and the story we're wanting to strengthen in our life, then that gives us a sense of momentum and consistency in what we're building in our internal world. I want to give you an example of that, because I think it would be helpful. I know, and this is where looking at what's developed by the age of 7, because our core personality is developed by the age of 7, often the general themes will show up similarly over a lifetime. Say, if that 7-year-old is starting to show signs of people pleasing, for example, that might be there across a lifetime. But it will develop and mature and transform with more life experience and developmentally as well. I think looking back on myself as a child and quite young, I always leant towards the idea of kindness. I found that really appealing really early on. I remember reading about that value in storybooks and getting a real kick out of acts of kindness, sort of doing things for people and surprising them. However, because of other circumstances, people pleasing really hijacked that and took that into a direction which was much more about a fear-driven wanting to avoid criticism, avoid judgment. And I thought at the time it was kindness, but in hindsight, I can see a lot of the time it was more about placating people and finding comfort in that. What that eventually was able to grow into was more of an understanding that kindness can actually be in holding boundaries. And sometimes we think it's kind to say something that we know someone wants to hear or be the person they want us to be, but it actually isn't kind to them at all if it's keeping them stuck, let alone us. And then that would be the latter part of my experience, and actually bringing that kindness as a North Star, centering myself, that the kindness still really matters, but I appreciate what's kind to my world and my needs, not just what's going to make someone else happy, and the ratio of those things that shifted, because I understand ultimately the better I'm able to look after myself, the more I can then give back. So it's quite full circle. But that's the genesis of a value over a lifetime, which has the same, like it's the same word. And this is why it's important. And like the dating example is like, you could show off and just say, I value being kind, and someone else could mean that too, and go away and enable someone or placate or people please or be avoidant and think that's what they're doing. And we could be on the other side of that. And that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant when I said I wanted to lead my life with kindness.
Yeah. I guess an idea or an example sort of popped in my head when you mentioned sort of active kindness in regards to setting boundaries. And I think it was a conversation I had with someone, gosh, quite a long time ago, but it was in the eating disorder space, and they had a close friend who was dieting for a boxing fight. They've got to make weight, and she was going through eating disorder recovery, and it was some sort of sport that you had to make weight for, and And she sort of suggested that I think I just need to cut off from this person and protect myself because I can't handle the conversation. And there was so much power in that idea, right? Just the fact that they were willing to sacrifice something that they love dearly in order to heal. But I did put forward the idea, and again, I don't think there's a wrong or right with this because you are navigating what's best for you and you know the friendship more than anybody else. But if you were to put in a boundary with someone that you trust by saying, this is what I'm going through right now, if just for now we could taper off that one conversation, you're actually preserving your relationship with them by setting that boundary versus you going, this is so painful, I can't do it. I'm actually ready to cease it full stop because it's too much and it's really important to me because it's so emotionally driven and with really good intention as well. It's like you're putting your health first. That's what we sort of preach in this whole space is you decide what you want, put your foot down, progress. But there is so many variables in that. And just that example of kindness and setting boundaries, it's if you're getting more clarity on this, you can actually set and enable so many things and allow them to thrive versus you potentially feeling you need to cut off so many elements of your life because it feels like that all or nothing versus can we just navigate this one area a little bit differently? Because again, it's someone that you have a relationship with. It's not a stranger that you're going, oh, I just don't want to talk about that because that's a completely different scenario. But if you've got a well-established relationship with somebody, and that's not duration-based either. Some of us meet people and within 2 weeks, you're like, oh my God, they're my best friend, right? That's a real thing. But just by creating that space to go, okay, this is what I need right now. And I also really need this person in my life. Can I have both? It is actually showing kindness to both of you.
Exactly. Yeah. And yet an iteration of how we were taught kindness through cultural society might have been that you should just nod and smile and not cause waves, or that might be someone's understanding. So that evolution's really important. One other question we had was, how do you find or realign your values when they have changed over time and past values no longer fit? And I think you just have spoken really well to that as well. It's I'd almost be willing to let them crumble away a bit as we currently think we understand them, or if you haven't yet established them, and just pay attention to how you're seeking to make meaning of things. Like so if something goes wrong or something that you don't expect to happen, we tend to have a way of thinking through it that's soothing. Like, well, that's okay because I'm still going to be able to achieve this, or that's okay because I've got to spend more time in the relationship with that person. And you will start to notice what you turn to find the better parts of life, to find the ideas and thoughts that lift you up, that make things mean more, that make you more invested in being in the world and being in the life that you have. And that's very likely to eventually be clarified in your values, whether you're understanding them for the first time or whether they're reforming. I think sometimes it can be really helpful to almost go through a rebranding of them, because I say rebranding because it's usually that in the body of the value, there's a lot that is similar, or it even is the same thing, but it might become tweaked a little bit more. It might be developed from more recent life experiences, or become particularly potent in that era of your life because it matters for the season you're in, and that might ebb and flow with other values that sort of almost go up and down the leaderboard, say of your top 10 or so, that to what you need at that time in your life.
So I guess a bigger question, and then it might be our last one today, but let's say someone has had their top 3 values for quite some time, and I'm talking, let's say, for the last 5 years, and they're quite confident in this idea that these are my values. They're guiding me well through life. Like there's not a whole lot to question these values, but they're listening to this conversation and a few things are popping up, and potentially the idea that perhaps one of the values, let's use kindness, because that's what we brought up already, that the kindness is actually almost used as a tool to kind of manipulate social environments, where it's like, I have to be kind because then I reduce the risk of being told from the group or being disliked. So it feels good to be kind because you get the positive reinforcement. But on deeper thought, you're starting to realize perhaps having a family is more important to you. So therefore you need to spend more time with family, which means less time being kind to the people you're currently being kind to. Is it, I guess, common with these realizations that people might start to witness that what they thought was a value was a bit more of a coping strategy than what their real value is. And if this is happening, that I guess it's okay to feel a bit shaky about this idea, because if you've used that as kind of your guiding grace and now we're starting to question it and see that it was coming from more of a people pleasing element or coping strategy, that might feel quite unsettling. I guess, what are your words of wisdom around anyone who might sort of be going, oh, hang on, I'm not sure if my values are what I originally thought they were.
It's incredibly insightful to bring up in this conversation, I think, because it really does speak to the experience that in recovery, at least parts of recovery for most of us, there is a phase that feels like annihilation of your identity. And it really is that almost stripping back of everything that you thought you could trust, of everything that you thought you knew, of your own judgment, of your, it's like if we talk about your moral compass, it's like you realize the compass has been broken. The last 6 months hasn't even been working, and it's and you used to think, well, what do I use now? I'm in the middle of the woods and I don't have anything to work with. And it's completely understandable. I just want to really validate how scary that is. And it's in, we most safely discover our values in the doing of our life and in the responsiveness to our life. So you are not going to suffer or have less of an outcome because you don't know the word for it if you're open to being in your life with full attention and willing to look at difficult things and go to difficult areas. And then maybe in hindsight, you'll come back and say, oh, that's what I was doing all along. That value was there 10 years ago. I just didn't even know that it could take form in that way. And so many layers have come up that now I can see that gem that was under there all along. So I know it's such a difficult thing to hear when you're in that space, but just knowing that there's so much value in being in the grey, and it's the most reliable way to find a truthful ladder out is in being patient with it and letting yourself curate it as you go, rather than, and I see this happen a lot, as I'm sure you do too, with a population that tend to be more high achieving, perfectionistic, etc., is that we rush into signing up to values because they sound like the values we should have, or the values that we want to have, or the values that would be impressive, and we're trying to hurriedly like assign them to ourselves and then live to them, and maybe sort of skip a few of the steps in between. Whereas your values, one of the reasons we may, just come back to that first question as well, where we might feel misalignment to them, or that we're betraying our values, could be all the reasons I spoke to, but it could also be that they're not really our values. And if we're living to what we thought someone else would be impressed by, or society told us to, or even that we just would like for ourselves, but it's not really coming from who we are and what we're bringing, then the discrepancy between those two things will be quite stressful.
Yeah, when you said the idea of jumping to values, like even personal experience as well, because I guess surface level, it seems really easy. Like, I value health and I value family and I value money. It feels like a shiny object syndrome. Oh yeah, that's a good one, that's a good one, that's a good one. But if you're actually willing to do the work on it, and I say work with the whole meaning of the word, because if you actually really dive into it, and as you sort of said earlier, to find like the values in the values, you actually start to realize that perhaps your values aren't what you think they are. It's just that they've got that appeal to them, where it's like, oh, perhaps, it could be family values. Everyone else has got that value, so I adopt it. Or societal pressures make me think that I need to value this, otherwise, I'm the dud of the group, or I won't be accepted. I feel like there's another big conversation that I would love to open up a part 3 to values talk, and perhaps we could actually dive into that idea. And it was actually a question that came up from some of my community members, which was, well, what if you feel that your values aren't good enough? So you actually feel really in tune with them and you know what they are, but you're still acting on other values because they seem like the better ones. And the example, like this was from a client that they brought up, was the idea that they actually really value just being a really good homemaker. They just want to keep a happy home. Everyone's well fed and cared for, it's clean, and they want to be like the nurturer. But the pressure of it is really, no, you should be a homemaker, you should be making lots of money, perhaps an entrepreneur, and by the way, go get in your fit gear because you've got to have a 6-pack as well. And they actually really know what they want, but there's so much fear in being that authentic version of themselves because of other influences. So if you'd be happy to, I'd love to dive into that idea of, I know what my values are, but they don't feel good enough to actually pursue.
It's hugely important. Absolutely to be continued.
Wonderful, Jacqueline. Thank you so much for joining us today. I love every minute of every conversation we have, and I'm already counting down the days to our next recording. I'm not going to lie. But for now, I will leave all the details in the show notes, and thank you so, so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jade.
Thank you so much for listening in on today's episode. If you haven't already, it would be great if you could subscribe to the channel or the podcast. That will keep you up to date with all of the future episodes. We will definitely be diving deeper into values and I guess the idea of enhancing values and what that means and looks like for us on our ever-evolving journeys. Thanks again for being here, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.